Okay, if we can settle down so we can get the last session underway. We appreciate it. Thank you. As you would have gathered up until now, we've taken enormous care to get all the balances right. But unfortunately for the last session, because Catherine has dropped out, we have, as we shall say, a sausage fest. But you know, what beautiful specimen we have here in front of us. In all seriousness, just to reiterate in case you missed it earlier, unfortunately, I was informed yesterday that our colleague Catherine Koffman from the DBSA couldn't join us anymore because of an urgent exco that came up, and she had to present a number of investable, bankable projects to the exco this afternoon. So she tendered her apology. Nevertheless, we have some fantastic people with experience and expertise, not only on the panel, but also in the audience, and we look forward to a vigorous engagement. I am very, very pleased and happy and honored to welcome Comrade Trevor Manuel, who is on the advisory board of ACC for some time, and we even call him chairperson from time to time. And, you know, it's just how much we love you, Trevor. And so Trevor has, of course, been central to the anti-apartheid struggle and to the South African transition, and served in a number of very senior positions at the core of some of the incredibly tough trade-offs and choices that have been made. And since his retirement from public office in South Africa as not only Minister of Finance, but also the Minister leading the National Development Planning Commission, he has served on numerous international bodies, wrestling with a number of the questions of today on the international stage, both in the climate space, in the development finance space, and remains an active commentator and activist in various settings. Trevor, thank you so much for making time and being here, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edgar. Good afternoon to all of you. The panelists, Aklilu is from the World Resources Institute. He has extensive knowledge, certainly, of various countries on the continent. His present work in South Africa, dealing with, amongst other issues, water, fundamentally important. Paul is a consultant who's worked with local government across the continent, again, trying to develop perspectives on what is bankable and how you bring local government into play. And Dirk van Berg works at UKEF now, but has very wide experience of financing. And one of the issues that we were talking about over lunch informally, if I may be so bold as to talk out of school, is firstly, I mean, let's just confirm the presumption that municipalities across the continent do what they meant to do, that they provide services. I know that this is mainly not the case, but let's just presume for a moment that they do. Then the big transitions we're talking about are the additional things that we need for transformation of the African continent. What happens with water systems, energy systems, roads, and the big urbanization projects, and how do we bring these together? And the big challenge is that they need to be financed, and they can't be financed from the normal sources. But informally, this panel is of the view that unless you have stable institutions, financiers will walk away. It's easier not to deal with instability. Now, we have a particularly pernicious problem in this country, and even more pernicious in one province in this country where the metros are all, I want to use the word governed, but I'd have to use that word very advisedly. But there's control by coalitions which are highly transactional, unstable. They change. They have 3 votes of no confidence in mayors a week. And those kinds of situations don't invite outside finance in, but this is the reality that confronts us. So the challenge is clearly how you transform these municipalities, how you bring infrastructure finance into them, and so that the non-South Africans and the non-Gautengers in the house don't feel that this is a very peculiar problem. I am aware of the fact that the same situation applies in many parts of the continent. So how do we fix it? And there was one word that Muthaura used this morning that kind of jolted me, and that word is Shanghai. And in discussing what happens in Shanghai, and was in response to your story, Jan, about AI in Shanghai and being able to predict water and so on. The point about Shanghai that Muthaura drew to our attention this morning is that people go there and know that they have to stay there. They can't change their mind, they can't move to a provincial government, and they can't hope to get to Beijing or into some international financial institution. They're required to see out the governance of Shanghai. And that creates a permanence and a professionalism about what they do. And that's distinctly different about the temporary sojourn that we see with so many people who occupy key positions in local government, certainly in this country. And with those matters, I think there are a couple of other issues that arise. And this is the issue of accountability, which is right at the heart of this. If councillors, and because they employ senior officials in councils, are too accountable to political parties, then you always get wrong outcomes. How do you begin to change that? How do you reconstruct the political administrative interface and deal with that dichotomy? How do you, in a local authority, deal with the separation of powers between what councils do and what officials do? How do you reconstruct the incentives for what happens in a municipality and focus attention on those kinds of issues? And how do you deal with the issues that we should stop whispering about because they are exceedingly pervasive in local governments across the continent? Corruption, cadre deployment, the absence of strong performance metrics, and the opacity of supply chain management. So it's not quite, I'm saying, before you can talk about finance, there are a series of other issues you need to talk about, because if you've screwed up the institutions, you're not going to get the finance, you're not going to get the transformation, and people are not going to get access to the kinds of services that improves on the quality of their lives. So that's what we want to talk about, and I think let's put the abbreviated panel to good use by brevity and the invitation to have a discussion. It's a good time to have a discussion this afternoon. So Aklilu, do you want to talk about it? You've got a PowerPoint presentation as well, so talk us through that, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I can start with if it is projected there. If not, I can proceed. Actually, you've already redirected me to go beyond this and mention about the critical issues that we have to address about the institutional setup. But I want to really give a little bit background on some issues. Why do we need a shift? Like, look at the figures. I'm not going to talk about the figures, but because we've been discussing about this, like academic, like research, analytic results, and so look at the resources that have been allocated to water sector. The day zero of Cape Town, the issue, the challenge, the water being like a challenge for the city. So I'll be really discussing about this thing, about what we call urban water resilience projects. When I talk of like water resilience, please have in mind that not just drinking water for the city, supplying water, but also the water that damages cities, clearing up cities. So it's like both. So the resources, like the gap, you can see 66 billion backlog. This is huge. And I just wanted, before we go here, to see the state of urbanization that have been discussed before. It's not just resource. It's really good also to have the African context, the informality, and at the same time, the planning issues as well. Most of African cities are not that planned. That's also another dynamics. I just want also to know, because we are discussing about finance, our research that we already WRI published long ago shows that there are some partners that are already working in this sector, but they are fragmented, operating in silos. Like some of partners doing the borehole, some of them dealing with the too much litter, some of them are too little water, like scattered here and there. That is where we need institutional setup as well. So we did a kind of, in WRI, we did a kind of really a strong data analytics about the whole essence of the water resilience projects across African cities, in basically considering about 6 African cities, Johannesburg and Gabraha here in South Africa, Kigali and Musanze in Rwanda, Addis Ababa and Dredawa in Ethiopia. These are the 6 cities. So through this research and analytic, actually the project was meant for really helping cities to assess the institutional analysis the chair mentioned, how cities are really delivering or moving toward this urban water resilience. And again, the spatial dimension as well. It's not just an institution, but also the space, the entire watershed system they are really operating. That has been already assessed. And when I talk of the watershed and all those special analysis, I'm talking about the whole city region, not just political boundary. Otherwise, we cannot talk of water resilience. And the landscape assessment also tells us really a huge gap of finance and the need for analytic and really a support for the bankable projects, as I said. Cities and the donors say, or the financiers, they say that the money is available. The cities say they don't have finance. So what is the mismatch? So we found that there is a huge need for a technical support for these cities to prepare them, unlock the available funds So that's a critical area that we came up. And again, creating a pool of resource or a fund that could help cities to unlock really a huge potential. That's what we call the Aqua Fund. This fund, what we call Aqua, is not the Q, meaning C, it's C, African Cities Water Adaptation Fund. This fund was launched during COP last week with all partners present. So this is a kind of innovative approach that helps cities to really unlock bigger funds, because African cities, they have really implementing partners, but they need a catalytic fund that tells the donors, they attract the donors to crowd most of the funding, not just donors, but also the government, to really channel the funds to the right direction. So how it works, particularly this, it's based on the challenges that we identified. The data is a challenge. Mainstreaming the entire solutions have been a challenge, and difficult in mobilizing the resources. So this is really, you can read it from there, the solutions, a fund that really catalyzes or helps the cities, or in like a kind of incentivize really broader solutions that could be scaled to the bigger level. So the Aqua Fund, the African Cities Water Adaptation Fund, is really a good solution that really provides a technical support, helping the cities to develop actions. That's what WRI is doing, as well as helping the cities to really convert those actions into bankable programs or projects at city level, and then provide grants for innovative projects that really help the cities to move forward, and help the cities to crowd in and attract more finances, because that's where we start. And it's also good to have in mind that most of water suppliers in Africa are small enterprises, and in some terms they call them informal. That doesn't attract the donors, particularly financial institutions. Financial institutions don't put money to those informal providers. So this project really creates an opening up for those really what we call informal or micro and small enterprises to really move forward, create more innovative solutions to that scenario. And when it comes to the institutional mechanism, the Aqua Fund is not just a fund. WRI and its partners, we really created a huge platform that brings the stakeholders that are working in this arena, the urban water resilience, across African cities. And this platform helped us to identify the priority or the principles that should be really covered or agreed within the stakeholders. And the fund also functions within all these stakeholders. So the platform is not just about funding, it's about knowing who is doing what. Avoid really this duplication of efforts, and agree on the principles and help cities to move toward this resilience in a kind of coordinated way. And finally, I would like to say really that this is a huge initiative for African cities to really move about 100 cities to really better water resilient situation by 2032. And again, by the way, it is about benefiting 29 million people. That's a huge number. And again, because African, as we've been saying, population is dominated by young generation, and they need a job. And this project, the Aqua Fund, is also connected with job creation opportunities. So it's like dealing with technical support, incentivizing innovative projects that could really be scaled, and again, maintaining the sustainability of the whole process. Finally, it is about also creating a platform that brings all stakeholders to one table and agree on principles and the implementation procedures. So this is it from my end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Paul?
Okay. Thank you so much. I think just maybe some qualifying statements at the beginning. I was somewhat distorted and refocused by Michael's presentation earlier on. And it really did give us, I felt, a vision of, okay, so what exactly is it that we should be talking about funding? So I ended up restructuring my whole pitch around that. And if anything, maybe I was overly took to heart Edgar's opening instructions to not preach to the converted, and really use this as a platform to catalyze conversation and debate. So I really do look forward to that catalyzation. But I think even as we go into a discussion around finance, I think the very critical closing statements that came from Rudy and Victoria in the last session around the simple reality that if you are successful in transition, there are huge challenges and social problems created by that transition. So you need to make sure you have a fundamental response to how you're going to address the social impacts of that transition, even as you chase the money. So as we go into a discussion on where does the money come from, very much qualified by the opening guidance we received from Trevor. I think first and foremost, I think as the Impact Infrastructure Commission for Africa, we started doing some analysis on what could potentially be alternative structures we use for impact infrastructure investment funds. And first and foremost, what came out so clearly is you need to actually start having investment funds transitioning from being managed purely on a fiduciary responsibility to the investors, to taking a step back to much more assess around system-wide interventions that will then deliver public value to a cross-section of stakeholders. So the very nature of the fund is somewhat fundamentally different and really requires a baseline building of capacity around independent, holistic assessment capacity of that whole system, so that you start developing KPI metrics around really the transformations that are necessary to deliver as against the identified mission and outcomes detailed thereunder. And within that structure, you'd effectively need to have somewhat of a multi-asset allocation strategy that blends everything from grant financing to long-term credit, equity, to even potential crowdfunding when you look at some aspects of the social impact layers of some of these system-wide interventions that need to be approached. Even when you look at within that investment approach, you need to have, as it were, multi-unit investment flows, which are able to tap different projects that make up that system at different levels of development, so that you can have multiple pieces moving contemporaneously towards trying to move you closer to delivering some kind of an outcome. And even within the types of units, investment units that you're talking about, they would in and of themselves need some level of differentiated capital structures, be they cutting across from cooperatives to nonprofits, and then the traditional limited company type structure, so that it can provide a bit of flexibility and dynamism in terms of how the fund is able to respond and support different parts of an overall system. Now, by the very nature of having that level of complicated multi-layer fund, even your types of reporting would need to be fundamentally different. in terms of the kind of contracting, reporting obligations that arise, and even the administrative costs, so that you would need to start having the subcomponents of any fund almost being evolved in a demand-driven perspective, so you can somehow bring them online as and when needed to try and manage some of the administrative costs that are in place to make that fund operate and exist. Now, in and of itself, the deployment of those kinds of funds would have very high reliance on, or would be influenced very significantly in terms of the political environment in play, the social norms and practices that exist in the system you're working within, and would need to effectively build on a great deal of civic engagement that works towards building some kind of alignment around the mission outcomes that should be being pursued by the system in question. But by virtue of that differentiation, it does create some level of an opportunity to have investment in, infrastructure tends to be in monoliths, and being able to break down to smaller types of investment that you can even start building some kinds of micro networks that are distinct pieces that are connected, but they're funded and progressed at different rates, then becomes an opportunity that's possible. Now, you would need to have, for that system analysis to be viable, you need to have a capacity to do centralized data collection and analysis, looking at everything from things like spatial data for deforestation trends, or even resulting shocks coming from the deforestation, so that you're able to build some kind of dig down assessment of how you're progressing against the different missions, with they around food security or diversity, biodiversity preservation and the like. Now, what's emerging some more interest, especially of late, is the historical. It's not that old, but ESG in and of itself. The practice of investing in ESG actually needs to quite fundamentally change, so that you shift measure matrix to the overall system as opposed to an isolated company or a specific project, so that you're tracking in terms of the complementary moving pieces as parts toward an overall goal or outcome delivery. So even the KPIs you're looking at would need to be looking at factors around the policy environment, the organizational spectrum within which they're operating, and really looking at how the progress on the interconnected pillars of that nature are actually moving towards getting you closer to the target outcome. So it's really shifting to a much more holistic approach to factor analysis and impact analysis. When you look at Bloomberg itself, just last year was projecting that ESG portfolios would be hitting about 53 trillion by 2025, which would be 30% of total assets under management of around 140 trillion. There is some sentiment that maybe ESG in and of itself has already become saturated, and especially when you take into account the shifts and sentiment shifts that are coming from really the reports around greenwashing and the implications of that. you might actually start seeing significant reallocation or withdrawal from ESG type funding. Now, I think one thing is true. I think you have to accept that the scale of funds within ESG really does bring to the fore that it's not just simply about the size of the money, because in and of itself, it's not actually addressing the global crisis we're having around climate change. And when you take into account the IPCC reports of late, there is maybe a growing appetite for reallocation towards looking at more mandate or mission-based investment structures. But in and of itself, that will require quite fundamental new regulatory environments put in place. You'd need to have introduction of variable ownership structures for the different types of investments, and the emergence of outcome-based bonds or similar type financial instruments to make this a viable reality. Now, even as we talk about new instruments, I think we just need to simply accept there's certain minimum requirements that need to be in place. When you look at the scale of financing that's necessary to be commensurate to the infrastructure need, we need to move being very conscious and aware of the evolutions we need or we're seeing in the technology and governance space to really address the opening qualification that Trevor presented. That if you don't have the governance, you just will not get the money, hands down. And to what extent are you able to leverage transparency coming from new technology to make it more possible? When you look at infrastructure, are we able to take a step back and move away from infrastructure purely as a traditional railroad port type perspective, but broaden it to look at much more distributed societal impact and looking at the various value flows within that system with regard to them being deep, just, and transformational in their nature. So that would be infrastructure that cuts across to even include access to health, access to power, water, sanitation, the realities and strategies around planning, zoning, and settlement, and even potentially looking at the scalability question that continually haunts these types of projects, that they're not deemed as bankable because they're too small, to really investigate to what extent do we actually start building appetite to have some level of cross-border or continental solutions on this continent, especially in the context of the Continental Free Trade Area. Now, I think there has been reference made to the opportunity that should arise around carbon credit on this continent, because we do have phenomenal capacity and depth around that. But even as we approach that, we need to make sure that it's being effectively eyes wide and hands-on engagement around dealing with the allocation of credits coming from renewable energy generation, even looking at the extent to which you can use renewable energy to start doing direct air capture for extraction and storage of CO2 from there. Jurisdictions like Kenya, which have quite a depth of capacity around renewable energy, there would be opportunities that if you're able to scale.
Okay.
Thank you. If you're able to scale to that level, then you can actually start putting power fundamentally into the carbon extraction and storage space. But even as we look at some of the natural solutions that should be available, there are, of course, forests, but I think not nearly enough conversations go on around the blue carbon space, around the role or impact that mangrove, salt marshes, and seagrasses can have on really the level of sequestration being able to be achieved, and the efforts we put into really creating a conducive environment and sustainability around that. But as I said in the beginning, when you look at carbon credits, we need to be wholly involved in terms of how you go about pricing and value allocation in that space, and really opening conversation about whether credits need to be differentiatedly priced depending of the underlying activity that's creating that credit. But very long story short, there does need to be a recognition that in all situations there will be need to have evolution of blended finance, so that you can have at some level allocation of public funds at a first layer to deal with de-risking and really assisting with bankability of certain projects. And then going from that, you do need to start having domestic or local funds, as it were, being the first movers to crowd in other global investments because they have deeper capacity around risk analysis and risk evaluation in that context. But even as you talk about the de-risking and bankability, I think it's really identifying to what extent we can take advantage of progress in terms of data collection and analytics from decentralized finance. So we talk about investing based on truth rather than just trust. But I think even as COP was closing, it was great to see that we did have a relaunch of the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, which should provide a prime visibility in allocating conduit that can evidence a first mover impact return from infrastructure investments. But very importantly, they did set very clear targets and only focusing on projects that are deliverable from identification to implementation within the 3 to 5 year window, and then build from there, because those can give the initial practice. Trevor, apologies for running very long. Thanks.
Thank you. We may applaud. Thank you very much. Dirk?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. And I promise I'm going to be shorter than Paul. I hope. Keep me honest, please. Infrastructure funding has been the core of UK export finance for the last 100-odd years. We've got a very strong focus. So just quickly, it's an export credit agency of the UK government, and we're just one of many export agencies, or ECAs itself. I honestly believe that there's a definite niche for ECAs to play a role in infrastructure funding. As I say, we've been doing it for many, many years. We've got a particular appetite for Africa as a whole. Just a couple of numbers, and I'm just going to leave you with that. South Africa, I've got £3 billion worth of credit appetite. Botswana, $4.5 billion. Angola, 1.5, although that's fully utilized. And so it goes on. Mauritius, 4.5 billion. Countries that have taken up ECA funding really thrived, and there's countries like Ghana, not typical example right at this point of time because they are going through a little bit of struggles at this stage. But Angola, for one, we've done a lot of ECA and currently doing a lot of ECA funding there. And it's the one is the Benguela project, and it ranges from roads through to theatres. It's a cross section, and it's obviously water, etc. What we do is we provide funding to any and all industries and sectors, with the exception of fossil fuels at this point of time. So we don't do any oil and gas. There are a couple of exceptions to the rule, if it's transitional phase, etc., but we just don't want to have stranded assets at the end of the day. I think it's got to be said, and Trevor, you alluded to that, we need to have good governance and good borrowers at the end of the day. We do non-concessional funding, so we look at economically viable and feasible projects. Having said that, your commercial bankers, and it's a pity that there's no commercial bankers here today, but your commercial bankers and your DFIs, but particularly commercial guys, they look at a project over a very short period of time. Whereas the ECAs come in, it's a minimum of, well, not necessarily minimum, it's a maximum of 10 years for infrastructure plus a commission period or project period of 3, 4, 5 years. So your tenor is immediately stretched, and a marginal project becomes a feasible project at the end of the day. But a bad project will always be a bad project, you know. And I think I'm very jaundiced towards the local municipalities at this point of time because of the way that it's just mismanaged at this point of time in South Africa. Now, there are a couple of ways of us potentially looking at municipalities. And one such thing, and it's a great pity that DBSA isn't here, but I'll be actually meeting with them, I think it's the 9th of December, if I'm not mistaken, to again have an ongoing discussion with them for on-lend type of facility, where we will guarantee the DBSA, and the reason why we come in with a AA- rating. So there's an arbitrage between the South African sovereign rating and the UK rating because they then take credit risk on UK government itself. And there's a nice arbitrage opportunity in that. So we can provide good, cheap funding into the structure itself, and then obviously at a longer period too. Now, renewable finance, which is something that we're really very keen in doing, that can go up to 18 years, plus the commission period or the project implementation period of 4 or 5 years. So all of a sudden, you know, it makes it a very compelling product offering that we can come with. The borrower is critical. We need to have a strong borrower with good financials and or the ability to repay. We are no net cost to the UK taxpayer. What that means is we cannot take on losses, although obviously some of our projects do make losses, but on a net, over a period of time, we need to be a net cost to the borrower. So therefore, if we get to the borrower and or guarantor, you know, it's very good to have that. We can do any type of structure. We do PPPs, we do project finance, we do normal commercial, etc. And what we really do, we're complementary to the banking industry or the financial industry itself. We guarantee let's say, domestic or international banks facilities, 100% thereof, up to 95% for sovereigns, or otherwise 85% for corporate at this point of time. So we come in, it's a enhanced rate. What we also do, we guarantee that, but we also do put up UK Treasury funding, what's called a direct lending facility. Now that's at SIR rates, very, very competitive rates. It's 2-3%. You know, it's hard currency loans. We try to blend it. We never have necessarily 100% of the loan facility in hard or direct lending, but we do a combination of the direct lend and the guarantees itself. I would rather pause there and rather take questions because it could become very technical and I don't want to bore you with that. It's late in the afternoon and I think we're standing between you and a beer and I would hate to do that.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Thanks for your consideration for the liver as well. Have we answered the questions? Let's invite some discussion. There's a hand over here. And Michael's going to scare us. We've only got 992 days left.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Elohim. I'm an architecture student. And my question is directed to Mr. Aklilu. I hope I'm saying it well. So it's with regards to the Aqua Fund. So I found it very interesting. And I'm just curious to understand more to which kind of projects those funds would be directed to. So considering in case of landscape architecture, like if we were looking at sponge cities or like coping with flooding or many other issues as we saw in the presentation. So if that would be only directed to like projects in a macro scale, like in large cities along the coasts and bays that we have, they would like to improve or to prepare how we're going to respond to crisis, or if we would look as well to a micro scale in terms of small communities that are struggling with flooding for lack of infrastructure or drainage and sanitation and many other issues. And as well, if that would be allocated as well for projects that focus on water collection, purification, and distribution in the small communities or in a bigger scale. And lastly, if research projects and coming from within those communities that are in areas like with high risk of flooding would also be would also benefit from this fund. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's go on to Michael.
So my question is trying to address what seems to me to be a wicked problem. You suggested, Trevor, that first of all, the institutional stars have to align. Now, it seems to me in a place like Nigeria, it's a particular place, but 16% of African population is in Nigeria, so it matters. Those stars are not going to align in time. And so you're left with the problem of how to invest in a space that isn't institutionally investable. And it's a problem you have to solve. Because if you don't, all your questions about investability go out the window. It doesn't matter after a certain amount of time because you're screwed. So how to do that in a space where you're not going to get supply-side systemic change? How to develop robust demand-side platforms that can begin to pull, to demand transformation and systemic change. How to do the work on the ground to change the facts on the ground, to change the institutional space. And that leads me to a question, what does bankability mean in this context? I'm not being facetious, what does it mean? Very often, on the ground, it means unfeasible demands for financial sustainability in a space that has been distorted by decades or centuries of systematic dismantling of local economies for the transfer of value creation elsewhere. So somehow we have to find a relationship to investment that allows us to invest actually for things to happen on the ground to even have a chance for this condition of possibility.
Thanks, Michael. I thought I saw a hand over there, and there's one here. No, over there first. I'm going to be badly behaved on the gender front. Sorry, Heather.
So my question is around the level at which partnership is created, within the context of the funding itself. So if we're talking about cities, when a city, for instance, does not sort of have the control over its water, where that delegated authority or that level of devolution isn't there, it's with an entity of central government. So the context between sort of the local and the national, and where there's a break, where essential services, the city is still responsible because the political dynamics sit there, but yet the actual delegated authority does not. And so there's a fund, like for instance, this particular fund, the city that I've been supporting for the last 5 years, we'd be able to put together a fantastic application, right? But we can't because we don't control, sort of the ability, to make any sort of agreement, sort of around that particular source because it's not, sort of managed at the local level. And you find this, sort of across Africa, and particularly outside of places like South Africa, where the level of decentralization is not the same. And so how then do cities access funding, sort of when they don't have the ability through national arrangements to do so?
Thanks. Heather, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the input so far. What struck me in the conversation is that, what we're all aware of is that we certainly need new ways of doing things. I think it's very clear that what we've been doing up until now in old structures, old systems, it just doesn't meet the type of solutions that we require. I think in South Africa, as an example, and perhaps by extension the continent, we have so many complexities that we've got to address simultaneously. So we look at a community level, we look at commerciality, and my own background is in finance and banking. And not to talk my book, but just so you know where I'm coming from, we are developing a large-scale green hydrogen project on the west coast of South Africa. So that's my experience currently. So just in answer to your question, or reflecting on your question, Trevor, is the only way I've ever known how to do it is to take on a project that's big enough and take it to the frontiers. And where you meet a frontier like a municipality, figure out what the challenges are and then work and find the partners to solve those problems at all of those frontiers. The problem that I'm finding is that when you reach development, and someone spoke about DFIs and so on, and DFIs have to have both a commercial and a developmental mandate. We know that they must do both. They're not sustainable if they're not commercial and developmental. No one else is going to go there. In order to face the challenges that we need, you have to be courageous, and you have to be able to go into the challenge in order to solve it. And what I find is that two things happen. People either, like in impact investment, start to commoditize the product, and then you know that there's an IRR associated, and then you chase the IRR and the commoditized product rather than staying agile and proximate to the need, and then address the need on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's what we require now: courageous leadership prepared to test the rules, because that's the second thing that happens. If it's too complex, people defer to the rules. Now, we're not saying break the rules, but we know that the rules as they exist don't solve our problems. So we need courageous competency, and then we need proximate to need, and then we need people to actually get into the problem, feel it, look around, understand their job, and solve it. So my question to you is, I can only think I've been very encouraged over the few hours here because there have been unlikely parties coming together talking about the problem. And so I think if we can have those cross-sectoral conversations, we can begin to see things differently, new solutions, not we do it like this because we've always done it like this. So, and the other way is to focus on the people. So Aklilu, I was very encouraged by you because everything you spoke about was organic, it was responsive, it had a dynamic element in responding to need, responding to challenges. So my question to you is, what are the new ways and the new pathways that you see? I can only see that it's through the individuals, because in every system, however atrophied or however incompetent, you'll always find a superstar. And my point of view is that we must work with the superstars. So that's my theory of change, but I'd be really curious to hear how you reflect on that. Thank you.
If I may draw a rhetorical observation from what Heather's saying. if this green hydrogen project were put up by the West Coast municipality, would it have the same traction? Who's the borrower? What do you look for in the borrower? What track record do you want? How do these issues actually matter? If you look at the situation, and I'm sorry that I'm being so South African in this discussion, but Eskom is owed just under 50 billion rand by municipalities. Now, it speaks to, and almost in all instances, they have sold the electricity to citizens and have not paid it over. So Dirk, do you go to those municipalities and say, all right, you know, we overlook your trespasses now, here's a lot more money. How do you deal with this issue? Because I think that this is pretty fundamental.
Yeah. So I think...
And so, you know, on all, in fact, last week I heard somebody from Salga, is there somebody from Salga in the house? I heard somebody from Salga say, municipalities are not revenue collection agencies. And I thought, you've lost your marble. Because they can't survive without collecting revenue. It's core. It's core to their own survival, and that attitude, I think, would as being a major setback. And you know, we have to try and bring. I want to bring the panel in, but Manuel, por favor.
Thank you, Trevor. I love this conversation, specifically when it deals with. Sorry. Oh, sorry. No, because Trevor is my son, so. I'm Manuel de Araújo, the mayor of Quelimane City in Mozambique. I was just saying that I love this conversation because it always goes round and round, specifically when I didn't want to use the word when we confront those who have been, are, or dream to be a national government. The discourse is so different. When ministers of finance, and my friend Luisa Diogo, she was a prime minister of Mozambique and minister of finance, and Maleane, who was governor of the bank, we always have this debate. Their discourse, when they deal with the World Bank, is quite different when they deal with local government. What I'm trying to say is, like, let's point out how many countries in Africa balance their accounts. If we use the same metric, then all of them will have been bankrupt. Then there will be no conversation. If we look at the level of municipality debt, probably is either equal or very close to what is happening with the national government with reference to foreign borrowers. How many countries in Africa do balance their accounts? Very few. Probably Botswana, Mauritius, and even those who produce oil. I'm not saying that we should not be revenue collectors. Yes, Trevor is completely right in the sense that we need to work out a mechanism so that we try to balance our accounts. But the same discourse we use when we are negotiating with the IMF, World Bank, the donors, I think local government, I think sometimes they are too harsh to local government. They want local government to be super avid, but when themselves they are not super avid. So I wanted to, we as local government, yes, we need to keep our records right. We need to better our resource management and human management and so on. But I hope that those in the financial sectors, they should help local government to build the capacity that local government, most of them, they don't have. The issue of human capital and human capacity is of paramount importance. I mean, for your case, there are some reasons. And for our case also, like, we had municipalities before independence. Then they were abolished. And the kind of development model that we followed after independence was too centralized that sucked all the local capacity to Maputo, for the case of Mozambique, because of the system that we adopted. Everybody from the provinces who had a bit of an average intelligence, they were sucked to Maputo. But today, with this decentralization, it's very hard to get them back. Like the only university we had was in Maputo. So everybody after high school will go to Maputo. And if you go to the capital, like when you are 18, 20 years, of course, most likely you will get a girlfriend from Maputo. Then you will marry there. Then you will get employed there. They're like, the incentive for going back, which makes the capacity level even weaker. So there is no incentive. For me to get an architect from Maputo to my city, I need to give him a car, I need to give him a house, and I need to give him like a package. But again, the law does not allow me to give a different package than the package that is standardized. So we need, if we talk about autonomy, we need to give real power. The second aspect here is the, what do we call, fiscal policy. In my country, what we call empresas do Grupo A, it's like the biggest companies, they don't pay taxes at municipal level or in the provinces. They pay in Maputo. So they make their money in the provinces, but they pay in Maputo. Then Maputo gets all the revenue, distributes according to some criteria. Well, then how can we be sustainable when those who should be contributing to our coffers, they pay to Maputo? So we need also to think about the fiscal and the way the country collects receipts and give some powers. Only like in the last 5 years, the proper tax was devolved to local government in Mozambique. Before, it was paid to central government. But again, 90% of Mozambican local government, we don't have the capacity to collect property tax. And the law says when, how do I put it in? Sometimes I have to think in Portuguese. Like when power is devolved, it should be accompanied by the human resources and the financial resources. But of course it doesn't happen. You know, no money follows devolution and no human capacity follows. So you are given a task. Well, of course, we want more and more power, but most of the times we get some powers and we need to create our own capacity. There is no a national plan to give capacity to train local government. So that's like the conversation I really wanted to.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, that's fundamentally important because that's at the essence of what we're talking about. How do you capacitate local authorities to be able to undertake the development? If they don't have the skills, they don't have the resources, how do you do that? What is the starting point? I want to invite the panel in. So, Aqua, if you want to go to
the questions, thank you. I think I can hear the mayor. I mean, because I used to be like a leader of one of the cities in Ethiopia, like with 500,000 population, and then I can hear the direction, how it feels for the leaders at local level. And that is the capacity they really need. I can really understand. But in terms of finance, I would really also argue that cities in one way and another get funds to really invest in like infrastructure, whether it's the green, gray, others. I think I want to also pose like some issue of, do they have a capacity to capture those added values as well? Actually, we share, I don't want to say actually the name has been changed from value capture to value sharing. So do cities also, if for example they do a kind of broader sewerage system or roads in one way, so do they know how to capture? Do they have a capacity to really leverage on that finance and move instead of just waiting for funding from other sources and mobilize from the existing investment, charging for the values added for the investment and share it to the rest? That also has another equity issues because the road is here, the rest have no road. So do we have a mechanism even to charge those people who are benefiting from? I think it's really both ways. As we move forward. For Aqua Fund, actually, WRI is, by the way, the World Resources Institute is a think tank, a research an institute, also we consider ourselves also do tank. We do implement, like help the cities to implement projects as well. A project with a solution. Let me bring one example. I mean, when we say Aqua Fund, it's like not just bringing a solution on the ground, helping the cities to implement with small interventions. For example, in Ethiopia, we did a road safety strategy, and we mapped the entire road system in Addis and other Accra and other cities that we do. So we helped the city administration to implement how to reduce the jam. In this African way of planning is like a city center all the way to the out of the city. So we helped the city to redesign just a single route and then show them very small money. So this is how it works, and then the flow improved. And you can imagine the effect on the climate as well by doing so. It's very small money. Now, you know what? The entire city, the Addis Ababa city administration, and other cities also started channeling, redirecting their money because they saw it already. You know, the small intervention is like a grant for that city to redirect the existing money. In terms of where that money, the Aqua Fund, goes, it's up to the city. We, as WRI and partners that are members of the platform, sit with the city administration. Actually, we have also embedded staff in each city, either in South Africa or Ethiopia or Rwanda. So it's up to the city administration to identify the key projects. We are not the one, is it sewerage system, is it others? It's not WRI or the other partners, it's the city administration. The role will be helping them, providing technical support in identifying, and then channeling the money toward those identified key areas. And the level is, I can understand, it's like any city, in most African countries, don't access funds from the external institutions without the will or direction of the national government. It's obvious. I can tell this. Even the World Bank avail the money. They do agreement with the national government. So they channel the money to local authorities for single cities. I can tell, for example, one city failed to tap in that resource because they don't have revised master plan or structure plan. So they don't have a capacity to even revisit them, but then they are losing the money. So that's where the partners should just go, help them modify their master plan, a plan as a kind of program, so that the cities can really easily get access. And the World Banks or other financial institutions also will get a confidence to put their money. They will never put the money into a city with no master plan or with no structure plan. So if we really able to help the city to prepare a good master plan, then it's like a kind of unlocking and channeling the whole resource. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Paul?
No, I think just respond to the mayor. I think that's a fundamental question. And just giving perspective, I think it still remains a double problem. That, for example, in Kenya with medical services, they developed a structure where graduate doctors are forced to be deployed to all the regions of the country. But notwithstanding that capacity deployment, you will still have doctors in an environment where they don't have the resources to render the service. So it comes back to your question around how does the municipal area manage to get capital to deploy? For that, I think we need to open our minds in terms of how can you build transparency and accountability on how that money is collected and deployed. With the evolutions in decentralized DeFi, I think it's becoming more and more possible to have transparent tracking and data collection and analysis, but we need to ask ourselves, in many cases, the municipalities don't want that level of transparency. They want a block of money to allocate as and when they see how. And finding that right balance, I think, is critical. Thanks.
Thanks. Dirk?
Yeah, I'll just say that, lenders want certainty at the end of the day. They need to know if they are going to, make a pool of money available to you, that they're going to get repaid. And I think, the other thing is also what we've seen, and we spoke about it earlier on too, is that coalition parties And also, you know, where governments change a lot and local governments change a lot, they always challenge the previous, the predecessor's decisions. And we can't have that. As a lender, you don't, you know, you can't have it being challenged that it was a fraudulent transaction or whatever. And it wasn't. It was a, you know, duly authorized contract at the end of the day. But, you know, it's critical, I believe, that local government also clean up their act. You know, and I think we've got to say it as it is. They need to be responsible too. And, you know, there are certainly some very good, well-run municipalities. You know, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Homework for Edgar at the ACC. I mean, perhaps the worst example of local government is in South Africa. It's the youngest. We truncated from 800 and something to 280 just 20 years ago. And there's actually no constraint on what municipalities pay their senior managers. Many of them earn substantially more than the head of state and cabinet and so on and so on. You might say, well, it's probably justified, but, you know. So there's no constraint such as the mayor is talking about. There's also a direct elections for ward councillors, but it doesn't seem to work. There's something not fixed, and so it has an impact on the ability to then unlock the development potential of local authorities. That's where we need to get to, and that's what we need to scale up across the continent, I believe. But those are some of the issues. I'm going to take 3 hands. The first of those would be Salga, because I've looked for trouble with him. And then we move over there, and then we move to the end of the aisle, and then we'll be seriously out of time. But yes.
Thank you very much, Trevor, and the panel. I will resist the temptation to get into the discussion you started, but I think I'll touch on it. What I wanted to raise is that, just maybe from the experience of Aqua, is that what we tend to find is that even when there is a potential fund that is available, as you say, there is a situation where municipalities are not able to fetch that fund in order to implement projects. At the same time, the funds don't have the ability to fetch projects from municipalities in order to advance infrastructural development. I wanted to share a bit more, because in the presentation it was indicated that Aqua has developed that mechanism of bridging that gap between fetching projects and fetching funds. Maybe if you can share a bit more how that works, because that could probably be the solution. But in relation to the others that the chair raised, in fact, there is in South Africa a limit to what municipalities can pay senior managers. It was just 3 days ago that the Minister of Cooperative Governance published a regulation on how much would be the increase of senior managers, and it was 1.5% that she published. In the last 3 years, it was 0%. The situation right now is that some middle managers are earning more than the senior managers and municipal managers in some municipalities, just because of how the Department of Cooperative Governance has been regulating. The last one I just wanted to touch on is that I can't imagine in what context can somebody say revenue collection is not an integral part of a municipal operation, because most of the revenue has to come from the own collection of a municipality. But there are difficulties in terms of implementing that, at least in the South African context. But I think it's probably a discussion for another day in terms of how do we resolve those kind of things. but I'll be more interested in the first part of my comment. Thank you.
On your first observation, it's a pity that that's the Vice Chancellor. Welcome, Prof. Bakeng. It's a pity that we didn't have the rep of the DBSA here, because the portfolio of the DBSA is designed to deal with local government, and in fact, the S in DBSA is, of course, Southern. So they have a good Southern African portfolio, and it's worth visiting their website and just looking at the distribution and the kinds of projects that they deal with, and then having that discussion on an informed basis.
Thank you. My name is Innocent Wanyonyi. I'm from Comrade in Mombasa. I just wanted to add a little bit more on two things that I would really wish this meeting to follow up discussion on, even after here. So the first one is what the mayor for Kilimani was putting across, I think, and it was followed up by Paul. We actually need to dig a little bit deeper into this discourse on how we are cascading things from the global arena to the national arena. Because national government has actually capacity to implement most of these recommendations, projects, and so on. But now, is it cascading down to the devolved systems properly? Do they have the capacity? The answer is no. So we need a solution on how to capacitate them to do this. For example, putting in place climate policies, action plans, and implementing climate finance resolutions. It's not there at the devolved system, the way the mayor put across. The next issue really is when you're looking at financing infrastructure, then we need to look at also things that do not pay off immediately. I'm thinking in terms of returning the capacity, returning the systems back into the integrity that it gives them the capacity to provide. For example, if a water system is gone, what do we need to put in place so that it's able to come back and recharge the system within a reasonable time? I don't think people are there to be able to finance such kind of projects, and which do not qualify as such as infrastructure projects. Thank you.
Thanks. As the microphone comes over to the aisle here, on capacity, I saw a fascinating movie recently called Notre Dame Burning. It's just hit the circuit. And, you know, I watched the movie less to understand the cathedral than to understand local government in Paris and how they've equipped the fire department. It's quite incredible. I live in a city called Johannesburg that may have one or two fire engines for the entire city. It's a complete and utter disaster. In fact, no. Uninvited, a private company, Discovery, now has 2 fire engines running around, and they charge you extensively to put out your fire. But these things are quite important in the way in which municipalities ought to build capacity. What kind of services do they render, should they render? How do you provide a checklist of skills that municipalities ought to have, and how do they prevent crises going forward? These are quite important issues. But get to see the movie maybe this evening. Hi.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm Jenny Robinson. I'm currently at University College London. I just want to come back to the question the gentleman at the end of the row here asked, which was, who is getting financed? Who is bankable? Which is on the basis of the discussions of local government, really not largely local governments, but other kinds of entities within states, utility companies, or well-run entities within governments. And to just reflect a little bit on the dynamism of the institutions that interface with financing. So does financing perhaps have some perverse institutional outcomes? If there's an expansion of finance for urban investment, can this lead to the decapacitation of local government as national ministries wish to access the money instead, so going against devolution? Might it be that these bankable entities become less robust because they are seen as sites from which rent-seeking governments might benefit? So these are sort of the questions based on, the sort of other direction that we might come at these, from the we wish to build a better future, these are how we can make better institutions, but actually, what are the dynamics that might be observed in some context? So I'm not saying this is everywhere. I would suggest that South African municipalities are really the most well-placed for being bankable and invested in, and that other municipalities across the continent may be a lot less well-placed, and that should give us pause for thought. And then another question that follows is how to protect the investment and the returns on the investment, not for the investor. So of course it's important that the investor get the money back, but for the country. So where does the investment go? You're mortgaging the future of whole countries, increasingly using the financial capacity of states to fund infrastructure developments rather than loans or other kinds of things. So you're mortgaging the whole future of the country. Is the infrastructure actually delivering something for that country? So it's a bundle of questions which kind of really probe a little bit what sort of outcomes are people seeing. If you're in the business of funding this and financing different institutions, are they leading to productive outcomes? What sort of other institutional dynamics are put into play with financial investments that you're talking about?
Well, in South Africa, the 9 provincial governments can't borrow. Local authorities can because they have revenue-raising capability. And that capacity is then used, and they have to collateralize their own lending. And, but you need a government system of checks and balances as well. Amongst the big battles we had back in the day when I was finance minister for a few weeks and so on, and the Bretton Woods institutions wanted to do subnational lending, and we didn't want to allow that because you need a measure of control. It's fairly easy if Dirk comes along and speaks to a municipality. But once you open the door, and there's this perception of deep, deep, deep pockets of money from Washington, D.C., then you lose control over what happens everywhere. So how municipalities borrow, what they borrow for, and what I think that this is what we don't do enough of. A proper exchange of information about what works and why. Ensuring that it's not just sitting on a website, but that we can have live discussions about these kinds of issues, so that the Addis experience doesn't sit in Addis, but also informs what happens in Nairobi and Harare and Johannesburg and so on, so that we're always in conversation with each other about a range of issues. I wanted to make a point in response to my father, my namesake, Manuel. I looked at some numbers the other day about Ghana. Ghana's debt to GDP, and it's because they don't have a developed domestic capital market. I think that their debt levels are about 27% of Ghanaian GDP. But their debt service costs are now almost 60% of GDP. So they've had access to global capital markets, but at a rate that is horrendous. At a rate that will impoverish Ghanaians intergenerationally. So I'm saying there needs to be checks and balances. We need a lot more transparency about these issues, so that we understand what happens in the lives of people, because it's the only thing. And in fact, I'll give you the source. It's Das Kapital, Volume 1. The only thing that is collectively owned is debt. So don't listen to me, take it from the source. The only thing that is collectively owned is debt, and that's what impoverishes. And that's been the scourge of Africa. Professor Petersen, over to you to wrap, please, sir.
Thank you so much. So Trevor, just one small piece of advice as a former Cape Townian and Joburger now, to manage the service delivery incapacity, stop starting fires. That might help. So it's been a long afternoon. We've got drinks and snacks waiting, and a wonderful sort of speaking about the exhibition in the foyer. And please hang around, stay with us, have a drink. And Martin Heyer, our partner in crime with the Urban Futures Project, will share some thoughts in a short while, but after you've all been, a little bit lubricated. But before we disperse for drinks and a chat, so there's going to be a blip with load shedding between 6 and 2 minutes past 6. So get a drink until that time, and then just after the load shedding blip, we'll just convene in at the upper level, just at the back of the screen here. But allow me to just introduce our Vice Chancellor of the University, Professor Geti, who is, sort of running this big institution and 1,000,001 things, but has found time in her schedule to, at very short notice, to pop in and say hi. We've got colleagues from all over the continent, from all sectors, finance, money, running cities, and so on, and as you can see, pyromaniacs. So, please, we hope you can join us for a drink, and if you want to say a few words, then you're more than welcome. So let's get our drink on, and we will reconvene tomorrow morning at 10 to 9 and have the second day of further conversation. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Someone left their, it is an iPhone. I thought for a second it was Android. Someone left an iPhone, so please, we don't yet have to redistribute assets. So please collect it from me. Thanks.